Okay. All right. Anyway, here we are. Chapter 14. Finally figured out how to work this machine. Anyway, we got one more chapter to mention about the autonomic nervous system. So you want to look on page 518. And as you look at the introduction to 518, you'll see there, they give you a little introduction about it. You can see the bold print term, autonomic nervous system. It's not automatic. Well, it is automatic, but we don't call it automatic. Autonomic means it's independent of our conscious thoughts. We don't control it. It's already set. The parameters are already set, and it works beautifully, for the most part, to keep our internal environment in homeostasis. So as you look on page 519, you see in the first column functions of the ANS and visceral reflex arcs. Now I've asked you to come up with a definition for a reflex arc, and one person out of about 30 has responded. So that person's kind of focused and trying to get the job done. But anyway, the reflex arc, has three parts. It has a sensory part. Some people say it has 5 parts, like a receptor, a sensory neuron, the central nervous system, the motor neuron, and then the effector. Either way you want to put it, it's okay. Some people just say it has 3 parts. It's got a sensory neuron, central nervous system, and a motor neuron. So now as you look on page 519 in the first column, you see functions of the ANS and visceral reflex arcs. So we have these reflexes in our internal organs so that things are fed to the central control center, which is going to be the hypothalamus in most cases. And then a message comes down to address the situation. So you can see the term there under functions of the ANS and visceral reflex arcs. Now look over to the little diagram 14.1 to the right, and you basically see what we've been talking about. Here's the stomach. You have an afferent neuron that takes information from the stomach to the central nervous system. And then you see, there's a little difference right there. Instead of having one neuron, one motor neuron, you have 2 of them. I've been trying to figure out why there are 2. And I have Googled stuff, and it's like some of the things in science, we can look at the structure, but we don't understand why it's like that. So you can see you got 2 neurons, efferent neurons, and we're going to be talking about the preganglionic, postganglionic. You see that term, autonomic ganglia. Okay, remember, ganglia is a little group of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Anyway, that's a reflex arc for our viscera, our organs. As you look in the second column, you see comparison of somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So as you look at the figure 14.2, that table there is going to give you a number of pieces of information that differentiate the somatic nervous system, which would be working with our skeletons, our skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic nervous system, which deals with the viscera, the organs, and so forth. So look at that, and then figure out the differences between those 2 systems. There's at least 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 different things. So look at it. You can look over here on page 520 at the top, first column up there, and you'll see how they name the 2 neurons that are involved in the autonomic nervous system as opposed to the single neuron in the somatic. So read through that, and you will see the terms that you need to be familiar with, And so we come down to the division of the autonomic nervous system. As you look at this second paragraph, it says, note the major difference between the two systems in the arrangement of their neurons. In the sympathetic neurons, sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic axons are short. You can see that in the picture below. That's the top aspect of that picture. And you see down below where the parasympathetic neuron is, and that neuron, which is either in the spinal cord or the brainstem, has a long neuron before it meets the second neuron. So let's look down here at the sympathetic nervous system, very bottom of page 520. And you can see there from the statements there, the second line, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons originate in the thoracic and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. That's where they originate, and then they start to send out that little short neuron that you see at the top of the illustration. But you see they talk also about the sympathetic nervous system being called the thoracolumbar, because that's where the preganglionic neurons originate, in the cord, in the thoracic area, and in the lumbar area. And then you see down at the bottom, last sentence, it says these neurons synapse. That means they join, they come together, and then they've got some connections chemically. Synapse in the first sympathetic ganglia, which are generally located near the spinal cord. They're usually on either side of the spinal cord. And then you see it says the postganglionic neurons travel to their target cell, which would be a gland or an organ. Okay. So in that sympathetic system, as you look at the picture again, down at the bottom of page 520, you see the preganglionic neuron has a short neuron, and then it connects to a postganglionic neuron, which is on the side of the spinal cord. And then you got a long postganglionic neuron that goes to a target cell, which is going to be a gland or an organ. The opposite is true of, before we go there, look at the second paragraph. In the second column, you see it says the sympathetic nervous system is usually described as the fight or flight. Now, that's more of a functional type thing as opposed to an anatomical difference. Fight or flight. How would you respond if you were walking out in the backyard to look at some stars and you heard some coyotes yipping about 25 yards from you? You'd be making it into the house, wouldn't you? That's right. That sympathetic nervous system would kick in, fight or flight, get you out of danger. So let's come to the paragraph where it says the parasympathetic nervous system. And you see there it says the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are located within the nuclei of cranial nerves or in the sacral region of the cord. So they give that parasympathetic nervous system another name, the craniosacral. So when you think of the sympathetic, you can think of thoracolumbar, fight or flight. In terms of the parasympathetic nervous system, you can think of craniosacral. That's where the preganglionic neurons would originate. And so they would send their long neuron to a ganglia that is either on the target cell or very close to it. It's not real close to the spinal cord. It's closer to the target cell, which is usually an effector like a gland or an organ. And as you look through that paragraph, Look at the very bottom. It says the parasympathetic nervous system is often described as the rest and digest system. So when you and I were sleeping last night, parasympathetic nervous system is in charge more. Heart rate goes down, GI tract is active, and so you're processing your supper and so forth. Your respiratory rate is lower usually. The tubes, the airways would be smaller because you don't need that greater exchange of air because you're not moving around. You're not exercising. You're not going upstairs. You're not walking from the car to a grocery store or something like that. So it's the rest and digest system. So these two systems, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, seem to oppose each other. We say that. They've even got a word in the next page on 521, first column, second line. It says they antagonize. They directly antagonize each other. And that's just the way the author chose to say that they basically do opposite things. Rest and digest is different from fight and flight. Okay? But they're involved always in homeostasis. Now, a little bit later, we'll look at some of the things that the parasympathetic does and the sympathetic does, and you'll see how they antagonize each other or they oppose each other. They don't fight, but they do seek to find the ground where we're at that particular moment. Right now, my heart's not beating real hard. I'm not breathing very deeply. My blood pressure's not high. Okay? But if I start going downstairs and coming back up, things are going to change within. And so all you have to do is just let it work. You don't have to think about it. Matter of fact, you can't think about it. You can think about it all you want, but you can't have any influence on it. It's going to take care of you. Wonderful system. I think I've already mentioned, I don't know why you have two neurons two motor neurons in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. I've looked around for it, but just haven't come up with an answer. That's the way it is. Now, let's go over to page 523. You've got a little bit of a construction there of the two systems involved in the autonomic nervous system. As you look on 523, you see this heading that says sympathetic neurotransmitters and receptors. That's the overall heading. Now, you remember when we talked about muscle contraction and an axon, a motor neuron, came down and made an attachment. So you had a myoneural junction, and it dumped in acetylcholine when we needed to use that muscle. Remember, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. So, having said that, let's look down into the first column on page 523, and you see it says classes of sympathetic neurotransmitters. Here's sort of a carte blanche statement there. The sympathetic preganglionic axon communicates with the postganglionic neuron by the way of an excitatory synapse using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So you're familiar with that. That's the connection, the chemical connection between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. You come down to the second paragraph and notice it says the postganglionic axon, which attaches to its target cell, gland, or an organ, one of three transmitters: norepinephrine, epinephrine, and you can also have acetylcholine. Okay? So that's at the organ or the gland. Those are neurotransmitters in the autonomic nervous system. That doesn't mean that they can't function in other parts, but we're just talking about the autonomic nervous system today. You go to the second paragraph, second column, you see classes of receptors, sympathetic receptors, and they have adrenergic and cholinergic receptors. As you look come on down to the next, let's see. Well, you don't have to come down, but when you see adrenergic receptors, that means that either epinephrine or norepinephrine are active there. When you get to cholinergic receptors, those are the ones where acetylcholine is active. So it's really pretty easy. You got acetylcholine and you got cholinergic. So you got CHOL in there either way, and that helps you keep it straight. Adrenergic receptors. They have alpha receptors. These would be the receptor on a gland or an organ. So these receptors can either be alpha receptors or beta receptors. Now, notice that when you get to the alpha receptors, you're going to have norepinephrine or epinephrine working. And the alpha receptors, as you look at alpha 1, we're just going to mention alpha 1 here, found in the plasma membrane of visceral muscle cells. And that could be the blood vessels, it could be the GI tract, something like that. Don't worry about alpha 2. It gets deeper and deeper, and we don't want to do that right now. You look on the next page, and the other category is a beta receptor. And beta 1s are found on the plasma membrane of the cardiac cells. Okay. Now, we've got those labeled. Alpha receptor, A1 receptors, alpha 1 receptors are on visceral muscle, like a GI tract, whereas beta 1 receptors are on the heart. Now, they're on other places too, but we're just not going to get into all that other stuff. This will be meaningful to you because you're going to be probably knowing some folks that are taking certain kinds of medications. If you will look over in the second column, you'll see alpha 1 blockers. Alpha 1 blockers, particularly those on the smooth muscle cell lining blood vessels. And it says these blockers, these drugs that the doctors give, and of course you'll help administer those too. They block the action of norepinephrine and prevent blood vessels for constricting. So if the blood vessel doesn't constrict, but it's open a little bit more, the pressure goes down. So some of these alpha blockers will actually help a person's blood pressure come down. That's why we study this stuff. Somebody has high blood pressure. Well, there's several ways they can try to handle it. Sometimes they'll give you a diuretic, so you're always urinating. And you got to eat bananas and stuff like that. But here you go to this autonomic nervous system, and it backs off a little bit. So the blood vessels enlarge and the pressure comes down. Beta blockers, they bind to receptors on the heart, as we mentioned. And you see a beta blocker causes the rate and the strength of the contraction to decrease. So your heart doesn't work as hard. And you see, again, if you read through that, it'll talk about reducing high blood pressure, or they call it hypertension. Okay, now as you look at that at the bottom of the page of the 524, you see effects of sympathetic nervous system on target cells. We've already mentioned about blood vessels. We've already mentioned about the heart. So look on the chart, page 525, And you come down to where the heart is, and you see beta receptor, and whenever that's activated, you increase the heart rate and force of contraction. Now, if you take a beta blocker, that stops that. Lets the heart rest more. You come to the lungs, and you see whenever that beta receptor is activated, you dilate your bronchioles, which means the tubes that would allow air to get into your alveoli dilate. That means more air can get in there. But at this point, I don't need a whole lot. And so that doesn't have to work harder to open up my airways. And then you come down to, let's look at the stomach. You see there, and it says it causes relaxation of the digestive tract. Isn't that something? It's not as active because you're active in other areas of your body, so you need your heart rate up a little bit, and you need more air, so you don't need to be worrying about digesting food at that point. Okay? All this occurs without you even thinking about it. So let's go over to page 530. Page 530 and page 531. So you're looking at an illustration of the craniosacral system of the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system. And here you have a chart again. You look at the heart. So when the parasympathetic nervous system is, I don't want to say overruling, but it's trying to keep the balance, it decreases the heart rate. Like when right now, my heart rate doesn't have to be up. And I go downstairs and get something to drink and a bite to eat and come back up. Well, heart rate picks up, and it does automatically to provide the needs of the body. So the body senses this, got receptors that pick up on carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions and oxygen and so forth. And your body responds. It's an amazing thing you and I live in. Can decrease the heart rate. When we don't need that much oxygen, you see it says bronchoconstriction. So the airways get a little smaller. And then if you look at your GI tract, contraction of the digestive system, in other words, now's the time to digest your food. So in the evenings when you're resting after a meal, reading a book, watching a TV show or something like that, Monsters Inside of Us, good science programs like that, well, you're at rest, and so your digestive system is going to break the food down. Just some examples of what the parasympathetic and sympathetic system can do. Okay, I think there was one other thing I wanted to mention, and that's going to be the end of chapter 14. Well, let's see here. Yeah, back on page 524. Just want to mention on page 524, down at the bottom of the first column, we talked about the adrenergic receptors, and we talked about the alpha and the beta receptors, but you come down to the cholinergic receptors. And the only thing I want you to know there is that's where acetylcholine is released. Cholinergic receptor is going to be excited by acetylcholine. And of course, you remember the enzyme called acetylcholinesterase that breaks that down, gets reabsorbed into the synapse, into the synaptic bulb, or the telodendria, depending on what you want to call it. And so puts it back together again. We keep using it over and over again. So that's all I'm going to give you about that in terms of the autonomic nervous system. If you have some questions, well, you can certainly ask. And that's the last chapter now. I've sent you 12, 13, and 14. This is 14. So you got about a little 25, 30-minute lecture on that. This is really pretty complex, and you don't have to learn a whole lot. I know in grad school we had to cover a lot of stuff, but that's not necessarily, I don't think, necessary for you at this point. Okay, so I'm going to close this out and see you.